Okay, thank you everyone for your patience. We're now going to get started. So hello and welcome to our second. Okay, we'll get started and then Yvette will hop on when she can. She's just having some connectivity issues. Okay, thank you everyone for your patience. We're now going to get started. So hello and welcome to our second Konnekted Webinar. My name is Sihle Bolani and I'm an organizational culture strategist, a corporate communication strategist, speaker, author, and podcaster. I'm also the founder of Konnekted, which is a career and personal development platform for Black women. Now, through Konnekted, we offer a paid membership-based career development program that runs for 12 months, where we bring in incredible facilitators to teach, guide, and support Black professional women, and also equip them to successfully navigate the workplace and advance their careers. And then we also have these webinars, which we host once a quarter, which focus more on the macro issues that impact on Black women, because we value the importance of open forums to share ideas, to learn together, amplify each other, and establish networks with like-minded women from all over the world. The erasure of, so I write and speak a lot about the gross inequalities that Black women are subjected to, no matter where we are in the world. We are underpaid, we're overworked, we're unacknowledged, we're told we're too much and we're not enough. And so the erasure of Black women's voices and contributions and the silencing of our complaints is something all of us have experienced in society and political messaging, in the workplace, and sometimes even in our homes. When we demand our worth, we're told we're being greedy. When we excel, we must be using performance-enhancing drugs, or it must be nepotism. When we're confident, we're told we're arrogant. When we don't tolerate mistreatment, we're angry and bitter. When we speak out against gender-based violence, we're accused of supporting the white agenda and tearing Black men down. We live and work in a world that is hostile towards us, and we are realizing that only we can fight for ourselves, for the change we seek and the justice we deserve, because nobody else will do it for us. But it's also incredibly overwhelming. It's emotionally and mentally strenuous, and oftentimes just outright heartbreaking, because the deeper you get into this type of work, the more you realize just how bad things really are. So what do we do? Where do we start? And that's why having this conversation was so important to me. There's so much that we need to learn. There are so many intersections at play, and there's so much that we can learn from each other. We've recently witnessed how Black women played a major role in the US presidential elections. How many times have you heard people saying Black women saved the US? Or that they stand on the shoulders of Black women who have, as they've always done, fought for ideals that don't just benefit us, but that benefit the greater whole. I suppose this is what comes with your marginalization being so deeply entrenched. You learn that your freedom requires the freedom of others too. Joining me for today's conversation are three incredible women doing amazing work and passionately dedicated to contributing towards the creation of places and spaces that assist, support, advance, and benefit Black women equitably. We have Astra Armbrister-Rolle, the Bahamas Consul General to Atlanta, Georgia, Nadia Theodore, who is a Senior Vice President at Maple Leaf Foods, and Yvette Ratshikhopha, who is a life coach and entrepreneur. Ladies, hello and welcome to the Konnekted Webinar.
Hello.
Happy to be here.
Very happy to be here.
Thank you so much for being with us. Astra, let's start with you. Could you just summarize for our family, extended family here, what it is that you do?
So I represent the Bahamas in the southeastern United States. My territory covers 10 states that range from North and South Carolina all the way down to Tennessee. And we make sure that the best interest of the Bahamas is kept in this region. So there are Bahamians who work here, who study here, and who play here as well. And we do make sure that they can call on our consulate whenever they need assistance or in times of distress But we're also responsible for making sure that US relations with the Bahamas are maintained in the district and in the region.
Thank you. Nadia?
Hi. So yes, I work for Maple Leaf Foods, which is a iconic Canadian food company. Many of you listening might be aware of the current government in Canada and their commitment to sustainability across all sectors of our country. And in particular, the commitment to making sure that the growth of the Canadian economy is one that is deeply rooted in sustainability. And so Maple Leaf Foods has really embraced the idea of sustainable food production. It is the #1 carbon neutral food company on Earth, the first food company ever to commit to carbon neutral. And on our way to being carbon net zero. So I joined the company only 5 weeks ago, in fact, leaving the federal public service. And so it's been a journey, but it's good to be here and good to see my friend Astra actually on the screen, because we used to work together. So
Awesome, thank you. Yvette.
Hi everyone. Name Yvette Ratshikhopha. What I do, obviously who I am is a child of God. What I do is writing. So I've written a book called Living Consciously, which is about healing. It details just your healing journey. And I think deep down I wrote it for Black women. Like I know, because I only see that there's a reason why I'm Black and alive in this time and season, because I know that where I'm born and where I grow up is a big part of the impact that I'm supposed to create in the world. So what else I do is I do life coaching. I'm an NLP practitioner, which is neuro linguistics programming, and I help people heal from trauma through using those techniques. People improve their lives. People that have been through all types of trauma, from bullying to discrimination to just childhood trauma and so forth. And yeah, I'm also an entrepreneur, so obviously running my coaching business and leadership development, and also just marketing consulting and a whole bunch of other stuff. So that is me and what I do.
Awesome, thank you, Yvette. So I'm going to start off with a question that I'm going to pose to all of you, and I'd like for you to answer it in the same order that you introduced yourselves. There is a deep and consistent resistance to Black women, to our voices, to our experiences, to us as leaders. Why do you think that is? And why do you think it is such a strong and oftentimes violent resistance to Black women?
Well,
Astra?
I can go by my own experience. What I believe is that it is just Black women have not had the opportunity to sit in rooms where we are today being seated. And I think there's always fear of the unknown, or fear of something that we don't have much experience with. It has been aggressive, it has been violent sometimes, but I think at the very root of it's that we have not had the opportunity to be in places where today we are strong enough to go to. So I think the more that we continue to show up and speak up and be present, I think the more normalized it will become. I think it's a journey that we have to continue to go on, and we have to do so without fear. You know, many of us, Nadia, I'm sure, is one of them who can attest to this. You know, being in a room where you are sometimes the only woman, and then being in a room where you are sometimes the only Black person, can be very, very isolating. So for those of us who do have the daunting task of being that first one, we have to do so without fear, and we have to do so with pride, and we have to make sure that when we get there, somebody else walks in behind us so that we can begin to normalize it.
Powerful. Nadia?
100% agree with what Astra said. And, I think that fundamentally for me, what I truly believe to be true is that power structures, no matter what they are, where they are, and how they were assembled, at the core of them, the structure is really built to be maintained. And it's really built to fight against change. So those who hold the power really do build a system that is designed to lock others out. And you see that in Western societies where most of the power structure is held by non-Black people, and in particular, majority white people, both men and women, mostly men, but also some women. And then in places where my family comes from in the Caribbean, and other places around the world, like in Africa, where the majority of power structure is held by Black people, it is Black men and not Black women for the most part. And so I think that what happens, therefore, is when finally Black women that look like us, start to more frequently and more loudly and frankly more convincingly demand a seat at the table or a piece of that power structure. Again, the forces that are currently in power realize very clearly that in order to provide space for us at the table, it means relinquishing some of their space. It means relinquishing some of their power. And the natural reaction is to fight against that. And when the structure that you have built is no longer enough to do that, i.e., as Astra said, we have received the education that you told us we needed. We have demonstrated our ability to speak your language as eloquently, if not more eloquently than you have spoken it, right? We have proven that we are able to balance our family, which is another excuse that has been used throughout the years. So when the structure no longer is able to block us out, what you then see is an uprising, right? A real sense of violence, whether it be physical or mental. And it shows up, and I'm sure we'll talk about it, it shows up as the erasure of our experiences, as gaslighting our experiences, of making us feel small in other ways, of creating a only mentality. So maintaining a situation where you are indeed the only one at the table. So it's much easier to discount your experience, much easier to prevent us from speaking up and making change. And I think it's just a natural part of power structures. And like Astra said, we really just have to keep on pushing and make sure to as we are pushing up, to bring those up with us.
I completely agree. Yvette, your thoughts?
Very well said to both the ladies, Astra and Nadia. I'm going to echo what Nadia just said, to say it's about power, right? And people are not willing to give up their privilege. And I always say that there's a hierarchy, and it's always white people, right? White men, to be specific, a white woman, Black woman, and then children. So it's like this structure that exists all across the world. And Nadia, you did mention that a lot of times, it's white men. And in Africa, it looks like, black men are also still in leadership. But however, economically and in so many different ways, as Black people in African countries, we're still not in power, because the colonialism still exists beyond what we think, it has passed. So it's about power, and nobody is going to ever be willing to give up their privilege. The same way that white people are not willing to give up their privilege, the same way that Black men will not be willing to give up their privilege. And that moves across from the workspace to even in our homes, and there's just certain experiences that even your partner as a woman, or the people, your brothers, will never have to live, because they don't live in the body of a Black woman. You know, they don't carry anything that you have to struggle with, and they're not going to give up their privilege. So that is why there is resistance towards us coming into space, because first of all, there are all these beliefs that people have about who we are in society, which are perpetuated by the different things like patriarchal beliefs, religion, and so many other things. And then there's also, like, I was watching a documentary the other day on Ruth Bader Ginsburg. I think that's her full name. And just the fact that women had to fight to like the case that was in the documentary was about men being caretakers, right? And it's just like, yes, even if patriarchy will create this this misfortune for you, right? You'd rather women not have privilege than exist in a world where you see people as equals. You know, you'd rather suffer as a person, as a man, right, than exist in a world where women are equal to you. And for me, it's just like, we're fighting battles we shouldn't be fighting, you know, but nonetheless, nobody's going to hand that to us, right? The same way that white people are not willing to give up their privilege is the same way that nobody's giving. And we have to fight different layers of it. We have to fight black people and we have to fight white people, you know, so, or black men rather. So, and sometimes each other, which is crazy. But I suppose we'll get into that. And yeah, I think that's just that. It's privilege, and nobody's going to give us the seat. We have to go and take it and grab it the same way, because no one wants to give up their power because they're comfortable where they are. And if you challenge that narrative, you challenge the beliefs that they have about how the world should work, you're shaking the table. So that's my thought around that.
Absolutely. I think all of you ladies have honestly hit it on the nail. And you know, there's a quote that I love that I often, you know, reiterate when I'm speaking to people, and that's around the fact that any ounce of justice that we get, we need to accept that we need to fight for it. Nobody's going to wake up and say, oh, sorry, we've been so horrible to you. Here you go. You know, this is what we owe you. It's never, ever going to happen. And we have to brace ourselves for the discomfort that comes with that. But before we get into that conversation around the practicality of advocating and fighting for justice in the various spaces, I want to talk about the role of language in oppression. You know, there's so many things that we hear as Black women that are intended to erase us, to suppress us, to make sure that we stay put, to make sure that we follow the rules, we don't shake any tables. You know, we are labeled angry, you know, oh, another angry Black woman. You see it everywhere. You see it at work, you see it in the media, you see it when they speak about Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez, you see it in the workplace, it's everywhere. We get framed as being aggressive. I mean, if you think about how Serena Williams has been, you know, framed in the media as a sportswoman. If you look at the narrative that she's had versus white players who have done the same thing, also been equally frustrated, smashed a racket on the floor because you're frustrated, you know, that things are not going the way that you hope they would. But for them, it's, oh, he's just such a passionate sportsman. But for her, it's, oh, he's angry. She's angry and aggressive and violent. And, oh, Black people, you see why we didn't want to let them into the sport? You know, there's always people looking for reasons to justify keeping Black women outside of the circle. And so what eventually happens is that we begin to internalize some of these things, right? Then comes in the imposter syndrome. Then comes in the self-doubt, the not feeling good enough. And this also then plays out when you are put in a position where, like was mentioned earlier, you're the only one in the room, the one of one. And now you have this crazy thing that you're competing against because you're made to believe that you've got to be different from the other Black people and the other Black women, because that's the only way that you're going to be successful. Yvette, I'm going to start with you for this one, because that has a huge impact on our emotional and mental well-being and our identity of self. What are some of the impacts that it has? How does it manifest itself? And how can we start to build up, or I guess to insulate ourselves from all of these narratives that we are, you know, that are sent in our direction all the time?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Sihle. I think, yeah, as a person who daily, like on my day-to-day, I work with women that have been raped, you know. I work with the women that have been bullied, the women that can't speak up in toxic work environments. And I mean, a lot of women struggle with anxiety, right? And the thing is, even the stats for like just in your existence as a Black woman, you have to fight more than what the average person has to fight for. You know, that means you obviously have more stresses than what the average person has, you know. So a lot of Black women would have been through sexual assault. They treated their less than, you know, in different spaces, right? So that's another battle they have to fight. And then there's also just different notions and different experiences throughout their existence. And how it affects them is it creates anxiety, it creates the belief that they're not enough, right? So just even before you start, from the things that you watch, you know, as a child, if you're watching and reading news articles that say Casta Semenya or Serena Williams, you know, are aggressive, and you start to believe the narrative and you start to live it out, and you start to recreate it. And by the time you're already going to certain spaces, you already have this narrative playing over in your head, and you already feel like you're doomed, which creates anxiety, right? So a lot of people, Black women specifically, and I read something which is stats, but these were US stats, and they said that Black women deal with more anxiety, PTSD, right, than every other race, basically. And I found that believable, to be honest, because we know our experiences. And I'm not sure what the second part of your question was. Please just remind me of that.
How do we develop tools or find ways to begin to insulate ourselves from these aggressions and forms of racism and sexism that we encounter along the way, so that we are able to better navigate them?
Okay, thanks for that, Sihle. So how we can move forward beyond that is to find first the root, right? Because if we are to solve anything for ourselves or as a community, you know, of Black women, we have to look at where did this all start, right? Because if we deal with the symptoms, right, the symptoms are what we're experiencing on the surface. And of course we can't, but we can go and educate ourselves about that. This is not your narrative. So the same way that you go to an African child and say, hey, you know, your story doesn't begin at slavery. You know, as for women, you have to say, hey, your story doesn't begin in the kitchen, right? It begins somewhere with queens and kings and women who have been leading throughout, because there has to be a narrative shift that changes, that says, okay, if these women could lead, that means I am therefore able to. So for an example, I'll use the story of Winnie Madikizela Mandela, right, who was erased from history. And a lot of the people that, she was Nelson Mandela's wife. And a lot of the people that, and also even that, it's like just more than Nelson Mandela's wife. A lot of people don't know her role in that, you know. And for me, when I went and did more research, I was like, oh, this is her actual role. You know, this is her power. So little girls need to see different stories. So that means we have to open spaces up, and that's a whole different space. But like media and creativity, we have to come up with different stories and make sure that that narrative is changed, because the narrative that we've been told, right? And again, I watched another documentary which was about film in America specifically. And one of the first actresses that did really well was a woman shouting through the window, shouting at people. You know, that is a narrative that is like the angry Black woman narrative. I don't remember her name specifically. So we have to start by looking at the narrative that we've been told and start to change that. And then we have to go through other different experiences, because one thing is, healing is multidimensional, right? And as Black women, we need to heal. And the worst thing is that we're supposed to advocate while we're healing, which is the worst thing you could do to anybody, because the same person that has been oppressed by the system is the person that must go in and toy. In South Africa, we call it toy, marching and protesting, that's the word. So the same person that's oppressed, right, by perpetrators is the same person that must go and fight in legislatures, the same person. And when you are healing, you have PTSD, you have anxiety. So there's so many things, but first also do the healing work in terms of, okay, I have this experience. So part of that work is educating Black women about the fact that this anxiety that you have is maybe as a result to this fear that you have, maybe as a result to this, because then you erase the gaslighting, because they start to believe their own voices, because they realize, oh, I'm not crazy, this experience of mine is valid, it's real. And you started to change the narrative and say, you know what, your voice is valid, and teach them, how do you speak up for yourself? You know, why is your voice valid? You matter, and start to change those limiting beliefs. So usually there's always a limiting belief, you know, like women do not belong in these spaces, women cannot occupy these spaces. And those beliefs are taught throughout everything that I've mentioned, like media, like television, radio, the magazines, all that stuff that we've received over the years. So part of that narrative shift is to say, okay, this is why you're enough, right? These are the things that have told you that you're not enough. You might not be aware that they've created limiting beliefs like, I'm not enough, I'm not capable, I'm not worthy of stepping up into certain spaces, and created a deep underlying fear. It's so unconscious that you don't even see it. All you do is feel it, right? So we validate that voice, right? And invalidate that voice, then the woman can say, okay, so my fear, this is valid, right? And then start to listen to their voice and say, okay, I'm not crazy, therefore my feelings are valid. How I feel invalidated in the space is valid. And when you say their feelings are valid, then their voice is valid. And that's how women will start to own up and speak up. So that is as much as I can summarize the healing journey, is to say, find the root of the problem. And the root of the problem is that we have been systematically oppressed, right? We've also been oppressed in different ways, sexually, right? Emotionally, physically. All this stuff is stuff that has to be dealt with, because when women are dealing with those things, they cannot own their voices, right? So if they cannot own their voices and validate their feelings, they cannot own spaces, right? Because those same spaces go and tell them that same narrative they already believe. So you have to change the internal belief first, so that when other information comes forth towards them, they don't believe it. And that's my thought around that.
Absolutely. And I think just to add on to that is, when we look at the history and the continuous trend of Black women's voices being erased and being diminished, what essentially begins to happen is that we begin to develop subconsciously a vow of invisibility, where we now begin to believe that our role is not to be seen, not to be heard. You just got to keep your head down and make sure that things happen. You've got to come in and save the day, but don't say it was you. We'll never agree or that it was you. We'll never say you contributed anything, but do it anyway, because you have to make a living. You have responsibilities. You know, we all are striving for this feeling of success, whatever that means for each and every one of us. And so there's that conflict that exists and often stops so many women from being able to negotiate for themselves, or being able to say, actually, no, John, I'm not going to tolerate that. And since you decided to behave badly in this meeting, I'm going to call you out in this meeting while you have your audience, because that is what your ass deserves. You know? Now, Nadia, we've had conversations about leadership. So many different ways to tackle this beast that is leadership. And you have a successful career as a leader that everybody who has worked with and interacted with has felt you have just been such an incredible force in their lives. And just from the conversations that I've had with you, I've walked away and been like, I wish I could duplicate you in so many different spaces. So, you know, Yvette has shared some of the things around how we can work to not internalize these things. But when we walk into the workplace, you know, we don't always, most of the time actually, we don't walk into a workspace that has empathy, one that is caring, one that sees us as human beings with a full scale of emotions, with life experiences, with traumas that we see on social media constantly when we see people that look like us being murdered by police officers, or being attacked by right wings and all sorts of things. There is just constant aggression that we are faced with. How can leaders in the workplace begin to, in a meaningful way, practically implement ways to lead with compassion and with empathy, so that when employees come into the workplace, they don't feel like they are not welcome as they are, or that they have to pretend that they're okay when they're actually in such immense turmoil?
Yeah, you know, I think that it's really important for us to remember what the definition of empathy is. So empathy really means, it doesn't mean that you fully understand what the other person is going through. It doesn't mean that you have lived the experience of the other person or of another person. In fact, it's exactly the opposite. It doesn't even mean in the workplace that you fully understand and are able to provide all of the tools that a person might need for every situation that they might be going through that they are bringing to the workplace, right? What empathy is really all about is recognizing that all of those things exist, that you are in a workplace with people who look up to you as a leader. And you are in a workplace with people who have multiple lived experiences that are showing up with multiple realities, and understanding that all of that will impact how they show up at work. And when you understand that and you get comfortable with that as a leader, that is what empathy is about, because that then allows you to begin from a place of curiosity, a place of compassion, a place of inquiry. When you see something in the workplace vis-a-vis an employee or a colleague that on the face of it, your initial reaction is, oh, this person is angry. Oh, this person isn't being professional. Oh, this person isn't performing. When you then go back and realize, well, wait a second, in fact, I am amongst many different people with many lived experiences, then you can then really start to think, well, maybe this person isn't angry. Maybe this person is reacting to a lived experience. Maybe this person is dealing with something that clearly I am not aware of. And then you can be curious. You can start with from a place of inquiry to try and figure out what that is, and try and figure out whether you have tools yourself or whether your organization has tools to support that person in the best way possible, right? And whether that's providing that person with safe spaces in the workplace to talk with colleagues, or take the time that they need to refresh and rejuvenate and recharge, or even just providing that person with space. Oftentimes in the workplace, employees might not want to talk to you, right? We've all had that leader, that manager, that boss that thinks that they're very woke, and wants to talk to you, right? Like, tell me about your struggles. I want to help you. Yeah, maybe not.
Sure.
Yeah, exactly. Tell me all the things. I'm here to help you. And that's what I mean by starting out from a place of inquiry and from a place of curiosity, not from a place of thinking that you know it all, thinking that you understand, thinking that you have already figured it out. To me, that's what's most important. And what I would say, if you'll allow me just one more thing, what I would say for employees in the workplace, and what's worked for me in the past, is really to find that one person in your organization, that one person, and preferably a person that doesn't look like you, that's going to be your hype woman or your hype man or your hype person. That one person that when everybody else is trying to erase your experience, when everybody else is trying to pretend that you're not worth it or you don't belong there, that one person that is the champion for you. That one person who sees what you bring to the workplace as a strength, as something to be explored and celebrated and nourished and nurtured in the workplace. To me, that has made all the difference for me. It is the reason why I am at the organization that I'm at now. So even, as you rise in the ranks, it continues to be true. And I just think it's very, very important. And it's one way that we as Black women can really protect our energy and protect our mental health in the workplace.
Now, Astra, just taking it a step further from what Nadia said, you're in a space that's very much about managing relationships to be able to both get what you want out of it, because you have your objectives. And that idea is no different to what we would need to be doing, whether it's in the workplace or whether it's in dealing with social justice issues, being able to know the tricks of how do you get yourself heard and how do you get the outcomes that you want when you are interacting and engaging with people in a position of power, the decision makers. I know from South African context, a lot of the conversations that I see around people's unhappiness with the policies here, with government's performance, happens a lot on social media platforms. But also there are pockets of interactions that happen in like town hall sessions where government representatives would come in, but they haven't been effective in actually advancing an agenda that is beneficial to the country's citizens, and even more so an agenda that is beneficial to the women of South Africa, who are the biggest demographic group in South Africa. Women make up over 40% of South Africa's population, Black women in particular. It doesn't speak to the dangers that women live through daily as a result of gender-based violence, which impacts Black women disproportionately more than any other demographic group in this country. So all of the stuff that is dealt with is never really about the issues that are very specific to Black women. Black women have done all sorts of things to try and get these issues addressed. They've attended gender-based violence summits. They have had to perform their pain, where one woman actually stripped naked in front of our president at one of these forums to show him the physical evidence of the violence that she has experienced in this country because of the poor justice system and the repercussions for perpetrators of gender-based violence in this country. And so there's a gap that is missing between how we are able to effectively and meaningfully engage with decision makers, with leaders at every level, whether it's in government or even within the organizations that we work for. Because I know even within the corporate context, trying to have a meaningful conversation for change, specifically for Black women and the issues that we deal with in the workplace as Black women, is very challenging. So what are some of the ways in which we can approach these conversations differently to be able to get a different result?
I think the question you ask is a really, really important one, and one that I've grappled with for a long time. Just trying to understand how to use my voice in the most effective way. And I've tried several different things. I've tried shouting and screaming. I've tried, getting upset and joining the protest. I've also tried being silent to see if passivity will help the situation. And none of those really, really work. So I've taken kind of a different approach. Coming from the Caribbean, I encounter men, and it's mostly men who are in position of power, who flat out deny the aggression. They deny that women are suppressed. They deny that women are overly sexualized. They just flat out deny it. And so in a country like the Bahamas, where women have actually made it to some of the highest ranks in our society, we've become governor generals, and we've made it to CEOs, and we've even had a female who was a deputy prime minister. They would use those things to say, see, I told you, there is no problem. When in fact, the incidents of rape and incest and those kinds of things continue to go unchecked, unbound. So we do have these issues, and I place a lot of responsibility on the women who do have seats at the table, because the women who stand outside and march are one thing. And I think it's easy for men to say they are politically motivated, or they're motivated by something else. And it just always becomes a way to cast aside our voices. But for the women that do have the seat at the table, although there are few of us, I think it's important for us to show up. When you're at the table, You may have to sit through the microaggressions so that you can get the job done, so that you can have the conversation, you can have it intelligently, you can have it without crying or without screaming and ending a meeting. But I've taken an approach to always come back. If I feel like there was something that was said that is just simply incorrect about women, or that was simply offensive, I find a space and I find a time and I point it out. Mm-hmm. I say, in that meeting, you said this or you said that, and the way it came across to me was inappropriate. And I find that when you're dealing with men, because it's a different place and a different time and you didn't call them out right at the meeting, they usually, in my experience, would at least take a breath and understand what they did. And for that single person that I could touch, it doesn't happen again. When I talk to young men, when I talk to colleagues, when I talk to friends who may think that it's okay to say something to me because I'm a friend, I find a space and I find a time to correct them. When I talk to young women who think that, you know, self-loathing or demeaning themselves or hiding themselves in a corner is okay, I find a place and I find a time and I say, that's not okay. You have to speak up, especially if you're going to be in this arena. And so I think it's important for us to sit through the meetings and sit through the policy discussions and sit at the round table and do what we must to push our agenda. And we have to do it in a responsible way, because there are always going to be opportunities for them to say, see, I told you she shouldn't be in here. She can't handle the discussion. So you do have to sometimes bite it and sit through it, but don't ever let it go. Come back to the table, have the conversation, and have it in a way that that person can hear you. It may not work, but the more you do it, you'll reach them.
Can I just say that I can corroborate the fact that Astra does that, because I have, because we have had conversations after meetings where she says, I'm going back to that person now. I'm going to call them. They said something at that meeting, Nadia, and I went through it, but now I'm calling them back.
Yeah.
Give them their business. So I just wanted to say that.
I love that. And I think it's important, and particularly there's so many women who are new to these spaces, and the anxiety of even having to have that conversation, to correct someone, can be debilitating. And so even to be able to walk away and rather have it via a phone conversation as opposed to face, you know, it really is about finding different tactics to ensure that when you have those conversations, you're in a place of power for yourself and you can articulate yourself in the most effective way. Absolutely. Because sometimes standing in front of them and they are rolling their eyes and they're doing those heavy sighs like you're such a bother, it can be very distracting and very, you know, just make you feel like, oh, what's the point? And it can be very easy to want to walk away from the fight because of those passive aggressive interactions that are intended to actually make sure that you don't come back again. So I love that from Astra. So we are in this, you know, we find ourselves in the space, South Africa definitely, the US definitely, where there's this unrest for particular reasons, so many different reasons, because of, you know, race-based inequality, because of economic equality, because of just safety, general safety, wanting equal access and care from, you know, the people who are supposed to keep us safe. The fact that we don't see enough women who look like us in rooms that make decisions that affect us, in the US fighting for, you know, women's healthcare rights, you know, decisions that are made by a room of men. Nadia, how do we get to a point where we as citizens begin to engage in a meaningful way with policymakers and policymakers within a government level, because there's that government and community interaction that needs to happen at some point, because those two things can't work in isolation. But also it's the same type of thinking that needs to happen within the workplaces. bridging the gap between employee issues and leadership who make the decisions that ultimately influence company policies that are developed and ultimately the culture within that organization.
Yeah, I think we talked about this during our podcast interview, and it's such a difficult one for me because, I agree with you. I think that, when you're talking about the bigger kind of macro level, this conversation between community and the politicians or the policymakers, absolutely 100% important and vital and necessary. And in a workplace corporate setting, the discussion between employee and employer, very important as well. I think that the issue then becomes, who are you listening to during those conversations, right? Especially at the macro level, when you talk about community and when you talk about the interaction between community and politicians, who defines who the community is, right? So who is it that politicians are actually reaching out to when they're forming their policy, when they're doing their community, their community-based research, or their community consultations, whose voices are heard, and beyond that, whose voices are heard, and then whose voices are elevated to a level of being important enough to sit at the center of the policy formation, right? Because, you can have consultations with everybody. I mean, if politicians wanted to, they could speak to almost every citizen in their country, right? In some method or form, right? They could have multiple roundtables. They could use connectors. Many, government parties now are using connectors within the community to make sure that voices are heard and that you're reaching out to different groups. That's, that is almost, frankly, the easy part. The next part and the hardest part, and the part that is actually, if done right and when done right, is going to lead us to fundamental shifts in policy and in programming that changes the lives of people that look like us, is really getting to a place where those that are making the policies, those that are creating the programs, really and truly believe that the experiences and the voices of people that look like us matter and deserve to be at the center of what they are creating when they say they are creating a prosperous society, when they say they are creating a just community, when they say that they are creating a beloved community. And to me, that is the rub. And that's a little bit more complicated, right? Because that goes beyond that poor, I hate to use the word poor, this phrase, poor woman, but that strong woman, frankly, who stripped down in front of her prime minister. It goes beyond that. It goes beyond, how do you get that prime minister, that president, that head of state to understand that her story is the story, that her experience is the experience, that by centering her experience, by centering her story in the policy and in the programming, that in fact what you will end up doing is creating a just and prosperous and economically stable society for everyone. And I think that that's hard, right? I think that around the world, and I think that it transcends partisanship. I think it transcends left, right, up, down, I think that it really requires politicians and those who are creating the policy and the vision for the future to really have a mind shift in terms of how success is defined, and how we can really actually truly get to success. So, so I haven't really answered, maybe I haven't really answered the question, but maybe I've posed more questions than answers. But I do think that is really the framework for in which we should actually be thinking when we're thinking about how to connect community to power in all settings. It's really about changing the narrative, really about changing the narrative, right? Yeah, exactly. I mean, changing the idea of getting heard being the end result, to really and truly getting those who are creating the policies and the programs to understand that hearing us is the thing, right? That we deserve to be centered in the policy making. And and I'm going to stress it again, and by doing that, they're not in Canada, we always say that it's identity politics. You're focusing too much on identity politics, or you're virtue signaling instead of creating real policy. It's that shift. To me, it's to get those politicians and the community at large to understand, well, no, actually, everything is identity politics. Everybody has an identity. It's who you choose to believe is the centered identity. And it's who you choose to believe really deserves to be centered in your policymaking and in your programming. That's the rub. And again, not easy.
Yeah, absolutely. Listening to you, I actually thought of, there's a white woman who's a very, very senior leader in an international or multinational organization. And she had done an article, and I saw a quote that she had, and it was, in the thick of all of the Black Lives Matter protests that were happening around May or June. And her hot take was, politics does not belong in the workplace. And she was the head of people and diversity. And I was like, sis, this is not the way. Because everything about Black lives and Black bodies and Black women is politicized.
Well, and isn't it to have such privilege to be able to not care about politics for 9 hours, 10 hours of the day while you're in the workplace?
Yeah.
For some people, you have no choice but to care about the politics, because the politics is going to decide whether the generation after you has any wealth and power and status, is able to feed themselves, is able to walk down the street without fear of attack. So what a privilege it is to be able to go to work and not think about politics.
We've seen Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez absolutely lighting fires over there in Capitol Hill. And it's been phenomenal for me to see a young Black woman who's so sure about herself, who's so sure about her voice, but also so sure about what she's there to do, and being unrelenting about that. But there's obviously many of us who don't have that same type of approach or the confidence to even show up in that way in spaces that we know are going to be aggressive towards us from the outset. So how do we, I guess the first question then is, how do we define advocacy, particularly for people who deal with a lot of injustices and inequalities in the workplace, and they need to advocate for themselves, but in so doing, advocate for other Black women in the workplace who are faced with the same injustices, in a system that was never really built for us, in a system that has so insulated white superiority and white prosperity and white promotion, and white voices being the voices that represent that organization and its views. How do we get around that? I mean, I remember when I was still in corporate and I had this senior, well, this guy, he was one level up from me and he was white. And we were working on a marketing campaign, and his portfolio was a black market, fully black. And developing a campaign, and he comes and says, and I was heading a PR, and he had somebody in his team who reported into him who was a black woman, but a very experienced marketing person. And we both said to him that, you know, the work that they had developed so far does not speak to black people. It's offensive. It's, you know, we gave him all of the reasons and backed it up with the whys. And he just said to us, no, I'm going to do what I want to do because I know my audience. A black audience, and you're telling that to black women. And these are the types of resistance that we get, because so many black women now have discovered that, okay, when I'm going to have these conversations, I need to be very strategic about it. Always got to be focusing on the bottom line, because apparently that's all that matters in these organizations that we work at. But when you're dealing with people who are so intent on erasing all of your knowledge, even to the point of acknowledging the what you know about people who look like you, who have experiences that are similar to yours, how do we deal with that besides smacking somebody upside the head? It gets tempting. Astra, what are your thoughts?
I'm just thinking through it. I think an important thing to do is, you mentioned advocacy and what it is. Advocacy is really when you gain enough public support to rally behind a cause that you believe in, or a policy or a recommendation that you believe in. And I find sometimes that in the workplace, especially, we don't speak enough to each other. So if in your example, there was you and another woman, but if there were other Black women, shop his policy around or shop his marketing plan around to them, and gather the feedback and the support to show him the facts. If you're advocating for women's voting rights or something else, then try your best to speak to women who look like you and who experience the same things as you, and rally and advocate and gather the support that you need. There's an organization here that's based out of Atlanta called the International Black Women in Public Policy Institute. And I support that organization wholeheartedly, not through my direct membership and participation, but I financially support that organization because I believe that when Black women sit at the policymaking table, then the things that matter to us actually get written into policy. So support is a very big part of it, and support is a verb. So making sure that we come out and we speak up for our friends and our coworkers who are saying the right things, but their voices are being silenced. Talking to other people so we share our experiences, and hopefully one of us who has the voice that can speak up will speak up with knowledge and confidence, because I just spoke to all of these other women behind me and they say the same thing. So I think those are some ways that we can begin to break those barriers down.
Many of us find ourselves in a space where we are very much aware of the issues that we need to deal with, all of the various challenges that we need to deal with socially, economically, racially. There's a lot. But there seems to always be a breakdown in our efforts when it comes to actually establishing and growing and sustaining action-driven communities around the causes that are passionate to us and that are important for our community development and our advancement in the workplace. How do we shift that? You know, so often I have these conversations, I get invited to speak at webinars and whatnot, and it's always, yes, absolutely. we've got to do this. We've got to do this. And I'll always say, if you want to engage further and you want to actually do something, this is where you can find me. I am a listening partner. I will, share whatever resources I have access to that I believe would help. And do you think anybody actually says anything? Nobody does, it's been one of the most interesting but equally frustrating thing for me is not moving beyond the conversations that we have. We talk about it, we all are passionate about it, we all hyped up and yes at the end of the webinar, and then we go back to living normal life. How do we get around that? I'm going to start with you, Yvette, because there's a psychological aspect here that creates that block for us to not go into action. Please unmute your mic.
Oh, there you go. I've been trying to do that, sorry. So, good question, Sihle. Yeah, man. For me, because I'm such a doer, right? I'm a doer, I'm a fixer. I like to fix things. And one thing, I don't like talking about things and not doing anything. So it's either I keep quiet about it or I'm doing something. So I'm one of those people, I know if I go in, I'm going in hard. If I'm silent, I'm just like, I'm protecting my peace and that's it. And I think it's also a combination of like a dilemma between, the anxiety and PTSD that we face by continuously immersing ourselves in this and not being heard, So a lot of times we will as people, just as women, I think we're depleted. I know in South Africa that's the case because women are dying in this country. And it's such an alarming alarming number that it's crazy that our government is not doing anything. So imagine, it's just like how, in the US, you see people being killed just for being Black, In this country, it's like every single day when you log on to social media, you see someone was killed, someone in the most gruesome ways. You see human trafficking articles and posts and missing children. That is literally what is in our consciousness, So there's a level of being depleted that kind of keeps us from like advocating and speaking up and doing that. So I think on an emotional level, I think there is a level of being tired because it's not like people don't want change. We all want to create change. However, sometimes it's like, I'm tired. I've marched, I've signed petitions, I've done all of these things and nothing is changing. And then we have to tap deeper into ourselves. And I think that is the unfair burden. It's like the unfair burden of trauma, right? It's not your fault that white people oppress Black people, but however, it's our responsibility to go and kind of heal each other as Black people. That's unfortunate for us, and that's the burden we have to bear. And moving forward, I think it's just about one, information, and just finding motivation, and that could come from community. I host healing retreats and so forth. And for sometimes these women, it's the first time somebody's talking about something, they're like, wow. At the end of the session, they say to each other that I didn't know that there were other people who have had the same experiences as me. So when you feel less alone and when you talk to each other, because I think we're all just going through our pain. And that's why I think the Black Lives Matter movement was so, there was an energy that it had, that it's like it went beyond the tiredness, and you moved past the tiredness and the fatigue and the anxiety and the fear, and you went to the streets. So we need to find something that pushes us, and it doesn't always have to be like one last straw, because I can say for South Africa that we're a ticking time bomb, like we're just one more thing, and it's either we're just going to all go into the streets and change things, but until then we can't just sit here. So I do believe that in individual advocacy, and in all honesty, even with myself, I look at the work that I do, I'm like, sometimes advocacy and doing work looks like me giving somebody else their voice to doing healing work. Sometimes advocacy is not always this broad spectrum. Sometimes it's literally like in your space. If you are talking, if you're teaching your daughters to speak up for themselves, that is advocacy. If you call out your brother, right, on these patriarchal notions that he has, that handicap women in the workplace, that is advocacy. If you are a CEO in a company, and you implement these laws and have conversations with women that if you have experience in that field, and take one person with you, that is advocacy. So we don't always, in those little movements, and one thing I'm doing is like what Astra said, is calling people to account. I think like one thing that I learned today, I'm like, okay, call them out privately, you know, because I get so emotional. I'm like, we can't afford to have these ideas. You know, you as my brother cannot afford to have these ideas. You as this person cannot afford to have these ideas. I cannot afford that as a woman, because you having those ideas perpetuates my oppression in society. You might think there's isolation between the oppression of women and gender-based violence and you having patriarchal notions. However, that is not the case. All those things feed on each other, you know. So I think advocacy is also just, you know, in the small, intimate spaces as much as it is in the bigger spaces. And we have to push beyond that we have to find something that motivates us. And I think that motivation comes from community and speaking with each other, just like the ladies also said, you know, and communicating, saying, this is my experience, because then we experience them in isolation. And one thing that the apartheid government did well was erasing us from the newspapers. You know, like one law that was illegal. It was illegal to stand at a street corner in South Africa during apartheid as Black people, because those, like as a group of Black people, it was illegal to like just have like 5 Black people standing in one place, you know, which is kind of like ridiculous. That, and it's crazy because I never made that link till later. That's why white people find it suspicious of us when we're just having fun as Black people talking. It's so crazy. But in that, it's like they took away community from us. You know, they segregated us. That means borders. That means, so in moving forward, we have to come back together, right? And speak about our experiences and realize that we are one, you know, and the only way we'll move forward is by sharing those experiences and then building one voice, you know, and you build one voice by changing the consciousness of each and every single person. That is how you build one voice. And that means each person has to kind of consider themselves an advocacy within their space that they occupy. It doesn't always have to be a big thing. So that is my take on that.
I absolutely agree with you. Because I often get asked about this issue of activism, and people seem to have very one-dimensional ideas of what that is. So people think, oh, if I need to be an activist, I need to go and march. Oh, I need to go to a protest. That's not my vibe. So I'm not doing that. And so they check out. You know, they don't explore the variety of ways in which they can actually advocate that are more in line with who they are, more in line with their resources, more in line with the time that they have available, but also still make them feel relatively safe to be an agent of resistance in whichever space that they are trying to push back against. Astra, I'm going to come to you just to take this a bit further. And as I guess one of the things that I and maybe other people really struggle with is they may have issues that need a civic level, that we actually have to engage with policymakers, because they are just the policies and the legislations that we have in place are not reflective of the actual environment that we live in. What are the ways in which people can have that? Because I know there are a lot of people, look, many governments don't make it easy for their citizens to get into those spaces and fight or lobby for causes that directly will benefit them and not benefit necessarily white people and white women as well as part of the process. So how can we go about doing that? I know in the US, and especially during the elections, there's been a lot of, you know, here's a contact number, contact your senator, contact your mayor if you want to get this done. If you want to do this, you've got to contact this person. Here's their contact details. Phone them every day until we make sure that we get the justice that we seek. But that's something that doesn't exist in South Africa. I've never seen our politicians saying, if you want to complain about this or add your voice to this, call this number and somebody will address it. How do we go around that to make sure that we are taking our conversations and our advocacy and our fight to the people who can actually make a difference from a legislative, policy, government level?
You know, I consider myself very privileged to be able to live through this US election. here in a state like Georgia. I went about my daily life as to, in the run up to the election. And I was also here when Stacey Abrams had her gubernatorial race, and we saw what happened there. And so Stacey Abrams has this organization called Fair Fight. And it's all about making sure that, voter fraud, voter corruption, and all of those things are minimized. Mm-hmm. And what I really liked about her organization is that it didn't sit and wait on people to come to it. Mm-hmm. It didn't use marketing and like the traditional social media campaign to get people to buy into what she was fighting for. Mm-hmm. It was the first time that I've seen, and I come from a very small country that is more similar to South Africa in a whole lot of ways, because it's a very passive political system. Mm-hmm. But that campaign brought in other nonprofit organizations, and they took their campaign to the people. It was a groundswell that I've never seen before. I recall very vividly going one day to a fast food restaurant and having somebody walk up to me with their Fair Fight shirt on and saying, "Have you registered yet? I can make it very easy for you. Just text this number or put your name down on this piece of paper, and we'll make sure that we get involved with you." I think sometimes, and this goes back to your previous question, sometimes it's difficult to sustain and grow action-driven communities because the problems that our people face are often very entrenched and very dire. If you take, for example, a single mother, it would be hard for that person to commit to walking the ground with you and coming out to your town hall meetings or making their voice heard, because she probably has 2 jobs and has 2 kids, and mounting bills are facing her every day. And so these things are a part of the most marginalized people's everyday life experience. And sometimes that will trump even the advocacy that will get that to change. And so supporting our organizations that change the way they do things, and having the nonprofit advocacy groups or following that politician that makes the extra effort to come to your door or to find new ways of reaching out to people. I think those are the ways that things are going to change. And also, I keep stressing the importance of cultural relevancy in our policymaking. We have to see people who look like us. I support people who look like me, because you know what I'm going through. And when you sit at the table, you're going to write the policy that's just like what I've gone through, because you look like me. I'm no longer relying on the man to sit down or to stand up on a platform and tell me all the things that he's going to change, because he can't change those things that he has not lived through. I had a very senior politician one time say to me, "There's no way that I could be sexist because I have 5 sisters."
I love that. I love that. Like, it's like,
what?
You realize that serial killers have people in their lives who are alive.
That's right. So I think we need to make the conscious effort, even though, because, and I understand that individual advocacy in the way that we need it in the mass crowd or the mass gathering is very important, but sometimes very difficult for us to achieve. But we need to find ways to support those organizations that are doing things differently, like Fair Fight, who's going to come to your door and make the change right at your doorstep. We make it easier for people to get involved in advocacy. I think those types of things are very important.
I love that. And I definitely think that it's an opportunity for us to get a closer look at organizations like Fair Fight and see what they're doing and how they're doing it, and what that means in the different contexts, different countries that we're in, different organizations. How do you begin to drive change in that way by making, opportunities for feedback a lot more accessible? Nadia, we have all been hearing about allies, and particularly after Breonna Taylor and George Floyd, everybody had a black square. Every organization had a black square and hashtag Black Lives Matter. And we stand with the Black community. And then the radio.
Crickets. as we say.
Anyway, here's our summer range. What are allies, and what should they be doing to be effective in their role if they are serious about being allies?
You know, I have decided that well, you know what, I've actually never been very good with buzzwords and lingo. But I have decided even more so now that I am no longer going to shape what is important to me based on these buzzwords like being an ally, like, you know, hashtag Black Lives Matter, hashtag, you know, Black Girl Magic or whatever. For me, the way that you can, it's actually quite simple. And it's been the same no matter who you are, no matter what you look like, and no matter where you live. For me, the person who is going to demonstrate to me that they care about people like me are the people who are going to do something for people that look like me. Simple. You can call it whatever you want. You can call it allyship. You can call it, you know, friendship. You can call it like whatever, sponsorship, mentorship. Call it whatever you'd like. It's no different than it was in 1952, in 1942, in 1867. Whatever, pick a year, right? Mm-hmm. When you care about something and when you care about making change, you change. You do something. And you commit to it and you invest in it. And that is, to me, what the people who are committed and invested in building new tables, in creating new spaces for people, in giving up a little bit of their power for whatever reason to ensure that those that look like me have a little bit more power. That's what they're doing. You know, and I say this to people, I give the example of a very real example for me to people now often. When I had my first meeting with the CEO of Maple Leaf Foods, his name is Michael McCain. And, you know, I said at the beginning that Maple Leaf Foods is really an iconic Canadian company. The McCain family is, you know, like I'm trying to think of an American equivalent that people would know, but, you know, they are the iconic rich Canadian family, okay? So even though it's a publicly traded company, it really is a family-run business. So he is the most privileged, you know, the typical privileged CEO person, right? So I had my first meeting with him, my first interview, and he started the interview by saying, "How are you? You know, you're still in Atlanta, right? How are you? It must be hard. It must be hard to represent Canada right now because, you know, you're limited, obviously. And I'm sure there's lots of things that you want to do." He had a conversation with me before we even started the interview. And then the second interview that I had with him, he said to me, "You know, you know, Nadia, that, you know, we have been interested in you joining the company for quite some time, and happy that, you know, we're finally at this stage now. But I want you to know that I am really committed to changing the face of my organization." And anyway, and then we had a longer conversation around that. To me, that's allyship. Maple Leaf Foods did not sign. They didn't have a black square the day after or anything. They don't tweet. If you go follow them on Twitter, they're not tweeting Black Lives Matter. They, they're not. And you know what? Maybe they could be, maybe they can't, they should be, maybe they shouldn't be. I don't know. For me, that's a conversation for somebody else. Because the conversation that I want to have is at that boardroom table. What is the conversation? When you're interviewing somebody, when you're trying to onboard somebody that looks like me into your organization, what's the conversation that you're having with me? With what intention are you bringing me into the organization? What is your vision for your organization? Those are the questions that to me are important when you talk about allyship. And I think that if we concentrated on that a little bit more, we might be less disappointed because we could more easily identify those who are committed and intentional about change versus those who are not.
That's actually very powerful and definitely something that we will be able to reflect on, because obviously it's going to mean different things for all of us, but definitely something we need to think about. How do we practically begin to apply that in little bits and pieces until we grow our confidence, until, people begin to get over the initial shock of this, you've changed. We don't know this person, because that happens a lot. That, you were so fun and so easygoing before. Now, who are you trying to be Kuntan Kinte in the office?
Well,
it just doesn't stop.
Exactly. And I have to say, for those who, and now I'm telling Michael all of Michael's business, but for those who are going to be those allies, they have to be comfortable with also getting that as well, right? So again, Michael McCain, he talks a lot about the fact that, some of his CEO friends are now like, oh, you've become quite radical in your old age, right? Because he is very vocal about how he feels about the US election, how he feels about climate change and sustainability efforts, how he feels about a lot of things that have, for some people, have little to do with making money, right? And so as a CEO, he often gets that from his CEO compadres. Like, oh, all of a sudden you're, whatever the equivalent of Kunta Kinte is for CEOs, like whatever, you've gone radical, or, since when did you become a tree hugger, and if you're going to be an ally, you also need to be comfortable with that change, with people calling you out for changing. And not only being comfortable with it, being happy about it. He's happy about it. He's like, yep, I feel passionately about it.
Yvette, advocacy is such a heavy load to bear, because once you get into a frame of mind that you're dedicating yourself to advocating for something, you want to stand for something, you want to contribute towards a fight that is bigger than you. But what I often see happening is that a lot of people like the idea of doing that, but once they realize the consequences that come with taking up that space, the additional labor, physically, sometimes emotionally, psychologically, the loss of relationships, being sidelined. There's so many repercussions to using your voice and speaking out in dispute of the status quo and what the current system dictates that you should be doing if you want to be sustainable within your role, if you want to keep your job, keep your opportunities and your networks. How do we carry that load? How do we take care of ourselves in the midst of this conflict that exists, so straddling needing to protect and insulate yourself because you understand your responsibilities. You might have a family to take care of, you might have young kids, you might have all of these things that you need to do, but also you have this really burning desire because you're sick and tired of being sick and tired of the way things are. And you want to fight back, you want to contribute something. How do we take care of ourselves in the midst of the feelings of responsibility to show up for our communities and to fight for justice, but to also not lose ourselves and be drowned out by what this work actually requires and the repercussions of the resistance that you face along the way? Because it sometimes could mean job loss or being blacklisted. These are very real consequences that come with speaking out against injustice.
So yeah, that's something that I've thought about, recently as someone who's in the, thank you for the question, as someone who's in the leadership development space. And I'm like, if I were to go and tweet now all my thoughts about the South African government, right? And then next week, right, there's a tender out, there's what do you call it, RQF, right, where they're looking for leadership developers, right? And they search my stuff and it all is negative. Would they hire me to do the leadership development for the government? And then I've had this inner conflict where I'm like, I am a very opinionated person. My page is very love and light, but I always look at what is my intention, right? That's the bigger thing. I've set clear my intention, right? So there's certain things I will not say on Twitter, but in private spaces, I will make sure I say in groups where I'm speaking at schools. And, I understand that there's a place and a time for everything. And if that is determined by your personal intentions that you've set for yourself. So recently, my intention has been to go about it strategically because I do have platform on social media, great, right? However, I've realized that we've been talking on social media for a while, but nothing has been changing, right? And I looked within myself, I was like, I'm skilled in leadership development. If there's a problem, I teach problem-solving techniques. Our government does not know how to do that. They don't even have KPIs. They don't even know how to hold people accountable. So my job is to step into that place as somebody who is able to, at least to try and step into that place and say, if I get the opportunity to work with somebody who's in leadership, any party, I'm not into politics, I'm into change, any party, and if I can assist that person through leadership coaching, then there's a lot of change that will happen. I might omit my voice on social media in terms of those topics. However, right, where it matters, I might be able to develop a leader and work close hand in hand and make them see the perceptions of women. So I think it depends on what is your intention, and those intentions are served differently, So find the spaces that you have to identify what your intention is. So as a person, right, I think we also just have to know ourselves and our capabilities. And like I said before, I'm like getting into the angry Black woman phases, because I think if not you guys also, you probably go through different phases. These angry phases where like, and there's like other phases where you're like, you know what, I'm going about this strategically, and then you go angry again, and it's like a cycle, right? And for me, I always look at, okay, what is my intention, in this scenario? And I'm not one that has, I think because of the experiences that I've had, like bullying and a lot of experiences that we as women face, I'm like, you know what, I'm kind of okay with, I don't really care what people think. I look at my bigger vision. My bigger vision is for the next generation to have better than what they exist. I'm not one to care what people think. If they think I'm silent on social media, but I'm doing work in the background, great, So put your intention first. And it kind of seems crazy because another thing is an entitlement to Black women's voices is also abuse, right? And we don't notice that because sometimes even I notice it when we're speaking up on certain things and people will be like, yeah, speak up, but it's like, no, you don't have to speak up. Your voice is yours. And that's also a part of owning our narrative. That's also part of owning our peace and taking back our voices, is realizing that we also have the right to preserve our voices. So that is like the trickiness of advocacy and mental health, is to say that you have to put yourself first, because you can't pour into advocacy on an empty cup. Yes, maybe the generations did that before us, but you have to go back, feed yourself, like be healthy, be in a good state. Because one thing for sure is that you're not going to serve this vision depleted. Yes, you can show up. I can do that, right? But if I'm going to do it sustainably for a longer period, right, I have to put myself first. So that when I step into these spaces of where I want to implement change, right, if I, for example, don't work on my own healing, I cannot step into a space with a man who has ideas about women, who sexualizes, because I will be triggered at every single turn. So my first responsibility is, one, to heal myself, right? So that when I step into those spaces, I'm not constantly triggered and I can create change that is sustainable. And even if I choose not to advocate, unfortunately, I get to keep reserve that, because part of the abuse that we face as women is the fact that people feel like, oh, you know, like when people point people and you're like, you don't know what that person has experienced in their life. They might have lost a family member to police violence last week, and you're feeling entitled to their voice, which is already triggering. It invalidates the experience, right? So firstly, we have as individuals owe ourselves to heal. We really owe that to ourselves. And then from a space of healing and understanding our bigger why, not because society says, your own bigger why, because the thing that makes a movement more sustainable is authenticity, you know, authenticity and being genuine in it, and not feeling pressured because, you know what, this is what people expect of me, because you will be depleted and you will have resentment. But you want to lead from a space, yes, you can be tired, you can be angry, those are normal feelings, those are normal experiences, right? But you always want to lead from a space of knowing your own bigger why. So that's how we can protect our mental health, and by realizing that the movement doesn't exist if we're falling apart. So at some point you're gonna have to sit with yourself and deal with your emotions and process, because it's ongoing trauma. And if you are in deep sadness, right, you can't advocate. If you are in deep, you can't, you know, you can't give anything to the movement. You can't, you know, you can't even give to the next young lady next to you, right? Because you have filled with so much anger and trauma. And it's okay to take care of ourselves first and then give our voices to the movement when we are ready. And that is going to take time, consistency, but at least it's more sustainable, right? Than anything else. And there's another thing that Sihle, the other ladies, you were talking about, how people don't see the bottom line, right? Because politics or what Black women go through or Black people go through, right, doesn't fit the bottom line of many companies. But we're the largest stakeholders in a lot of these companies, right? Your customers are your stakeholders. So people need to kind of care what we think about. So the problem is we don't hold people to account. And you might have seen that with what happened in South Africa recently with clicks, right? Whereby they had an advertisement and it had a white woman and a Black woman. The Black woman ad said frizzy, dry hair, and then it was just like a mess. And with the white woman ad showed flowy hair, and it was like, you know, I don't know, angels were blowing towards her hair. So like there was like such a huge difference in how that was portrayed. And South Africa, first of all, it took a seemingly angry political party to push that agenda, right? And sometimes we are our own enemies because we think anger is a negative thing, which is it's not always. Because in order to create change, you also need to be angry, right? You just need to direct your anger with great intention, purpose, and action. So in that, right, Black people are the biggest stakeholders in a lot of companies because we are buyers, and people like us because we've been programmed to be consumers. So in understanding our value and our worth, we are able to hold people accountable because we know that they need our money, right? We know that these companies do not exist. And the longer we don't realize our worth is the more that we tolerate abuse through media, through ad campaigns that do not speak of who we are, do not honor us, and all of those things. So that's mental health in a different way, because I think everything starts at our value, because what has been depreciated over time is our value. And what we need to look at is our value and our worth and our voices, and validate those voices and step into those places through validating those voices, and also just being self-aware enough to say, you know what, here I can rest, you know, rest, take time off and step back into the movement, because the movement will be sustainable. I can now give to my daughters for longer, because if you are not okay, how are you going to teach your daughters, your sons about these things that you want them to create change in, you know? So take care of yourself first and know that your voice is yours. You don't owe a movement your voice, right? But you can lend it to it, considering that it is part of your vision, your intention. Yes, we need change, but we need whole people. We need people who have clarity and who know their own intentions, so that movements are more sustainable. It's not just like a thing that you feel pressured into getting to because, okay, these are our struggles. We do need those voices. However, if they're going to be sustainable, people have to have their own inner why, and people have to take care of themselves so that they're more sustainable.
Absolutely. And, you know, just coming onto the back of this click story that you mentioned, I had the most bizarre experience because when that happened, I think it was probably about 2 weeks or so since that whole reputational issue for them came out. And I never said anything. I never commented. I just pretended it did not exist because I needed the time to process what was happening, what that means for me, and how then can I effectively use my voice in this context to address these issues and what they actually mean. Without the fluffy language about microaggressions when we actually want to say racism. And so a few weeks later, I decided to write a blog article about it and put it up on my website, and then obviously shared it on my social media platforms. And the most interesting thing happened. A Black man wrote to me, commented when I posted the article, and said to me something along the lines of, "Oh, I'm so glad that you wrote something. I was getting very concerned about your silence." I was like, just because I happen to speak about these issues does not mean that I want to speak about it every single time an incident comes up. And I think that's one of the things that, people who are advocates for certain things or who speak up for certain issues, the expectation is that you're constantly switched on, constantly ready to respond to something without any thought about what we need to be refueled and replenished as part of the process. So there's this expectation that you need to come and be my voice and speak for me, but I'm not going to do anything in return for you to fill up your cup in the process. And that's been one of the biggest frustrations that I've had about this space. You see it whether you're in South Africa or the US or wherever you are. These things are common because, unfortunately, the very people that we're often trying to help are the ones who just wanted to take and benefit from the work that you're doing without contributing to the process as well. And that's something that we need to start speaking about. Astra, strong Black women. In South Africa, they call them imbogoto, which is a rock. And every year, I always post and say, do not refer to me as a rock. I am not a rock. I am not hard. I very much soft. I very much want a gentle life. I don't want to be struck. I don't want to have to go through all of these extremes to be living up to a standard that requires me to be this superhuman in a world of injustices that are harmful for me year after year after year. But, I'm supposed to be excited about the fact that I'm considered a rock. I have a serious issue about the fact that, we have grown to admire strength in Black women because we don't have strength because we want it. We have strength because we literally have no other choice but to be strong because of the world that we live in. What are your views on that?
My views on strength and why we need to be strong. I think that Black women are special. I think it needs to be someone. There's a saying that if not me, then who? And if not now, then when? And I think we can spend a whole lot of time thinking about why us and why couldn't it be somebody else, and how do I stop this? But I think that the journey that we go through does a lot of great things for our society. I think the journey that we go through develops really resilient children. I think the journey that we have to go through develops really resilient societies. I think the strength of a Black woman and what she brings to the table I mean, part of it is probably the reason why we've been suppressed. A lot of people will tell you that people may be afraid of what you can actually be. And so I no longer get tired when people say that you're strong, so I expect it of you. I try not to get weary. Like Yvette was saying, when I need to take a rest, I take a rest. But I no longer worry about why me, because it is me. And I am here, and I am Black, and I am disadvantaged. And I will fight the fight, and I will teach other women to do the same. And I will support wherever I can, because it's the fate, it's the hand that I've been dealt. But I will no longer look at it as I wish it wasn't me, or why couldn't it be somebody else, you know? I think that's the best way I can answer that question.
And ladies, how can we begin to show up for other women in our daily lives, in our attempts to build communities with people who are in the same space that we're in, who want the same things, and you know, in all of the various forms of justice that we're pursuing?
I think we talk to each other. I think a lot of times, and in the Caribbean, I can't really speak to a lot of other places, but I think there has been, and I don't like talking about it, but there has been this notion that women do it to ourselves, like we pull other women down. But I've made very conscious efforts to stop highlighting that, because there are so many women today who don't do that. There's so many women today who open the door and who have the conversation, who answer the phone. So I'm not here to harp on, you know, what women do to other women, but I am here to say that you should join the movement and help a sister out if she needs you. If she calls on you, it's probably because she has a whole lot of respect for you, or she values your opinion, so talk to her. It also has a lot to do with being responsible when you are placed in a position where you can make change. So do a great job so that another Black woman can walk in the door behind you. And yeah, just show up for a woman, call a woman, help her out. If you see, you know, there's so many times that you see these very slanderous, negative things that are being said about women in an effort to kind of cast them aside. Don't forward that message. Don't post it and don't talk about it. Call her, ask her how she's doing, how she's coping, regardless of what your sentiments are about what it is. Ask her how she's doing and how she's coping with it. Every bit of support really does matter. And we can't do it divided. We have to do it together.
Absolutely. That's so important. Nadia, how do we, I mean, organizations have been making all sorts of promises about diversity. We've seen so many diversity chiefs popping up since May in various organizations, with all of these promises about how they're going to be transformed and they're going to become better, they're going to be more inclusive, and you know, this is just this magic pill that's going to fix everything. How do we hold our leaders accountable for the promises that they make?
Well, you know, I think that we've talked about it here, you know, throughout our time together. I think that things that we've all unsurfaced already. Astra mentioned sitting through the meeting, gathering up the information that you need, getting the job done, but then circling back to hold those people to account. You know, I mentioned the fact that we as women, as Black women, our voices are important. And so being intentional about who we give our time to, who we give our energy to, where we decide to work, that is a way to hold people accountable. You know, Yvette talked about the fact that we actually need to take time when we need to take time to recharge so that we can go back into the arena for another day of fight. That's also how we hold people to account. If we're tired, you know, if we are fighting every battle indiscriminately with no strategy behind it, that is not a way to hold people to account. That is a way to ensure that you give those people what they want, which is chaos and disorganization, and a path to nowhere. So all of those things that we've been talking about, to me, is a way to hold people to account. And I think that, you know, the thread to me of this conversation has been that baby steps are still steps. That sometimes it's not about the grand gestures. That many times, most times, it is about those individual actions that we take and that others take, and that we encourage and force others to take, that are going to lead us towards a sustained path for change. And to me, that's what holding people accountable is all about.
Absolutely. There is tons of research. I feel like it's almost every year this type of research is done, which shows the jarring inequalities that relate to income, opportunities, and the lack of support for Black women. But despite all of these insights, there's a resistance, right? And each woman who tries to fight for these things is often gaslit and put through all of these hoops to prove that these inequalities exist. How do we overcome this at a policy level and a leadership level, as well as the mental, emotional level of constantly, there's always one more thing you need to do to prove that your experiences are real? Even when there's scientific evidence, there's all sorts of research that even universities are putting out that affirm everything that Black women have been saying for years around the challenges that we face. But even with all of that information that we equip ourselves with, there's always one more reason why it's not good enough to influence or lead to meaningful change. Astra?
Can you repeat that for me, please?
Sure. So there's a lot of research that gets released almost on an annual basis that speaks to the jarring inequalities around income, opportunities, and support for Black women. Mm-hmm. But despite this, there's this resistance, and each Black woman who tries to, because we all know if you're going to go into a conversation with your leaders, you have to have it together. You have to have all of your stats. You have to have all of your research to back you up, with various sources. Making sure that you have research from white researchers as well, so that you're not accused of being biased. But even in contexts where we have all of this information backing us up, all of this, this data that supports the fact that Black women are unsupported, that they don't have access to the same opportunities as the white counterparts, we're often gaslit and put through so many hoops to continue to prove ourselves and to prove that our experiences are real. There's always one more thing that we're required to do before people will consider our grievances and think about how they can fix them if they feel that the grievances are significant. How do we navigate that?
I think the best way to navigate it is to fight against it. Really and truly, it doesn't matter to me what their research tells them. My experience is real, and I don't let anybody take that from me. When it comes to navigating salaries, I can very easily not work for you. Very easily. Especially if you brought me to the table. If I ask for an amount and that amount is beyond what you can give, especially if I've done my research and I know that there are other executives that are being paid the same amount or amount that is reasonable, then I walk away. I've gotten to a point now where I will not be invalidated, and I will not scream at the top of my voice, and I will not, slam doors and do anything like that. But my experiences are real. I'm not crazy. I'm qualified. And I will take those experiences where I need to go, even if that means making a new table for myself. And I think that's important. And I think that I have what it takes to convince other women to come to my table, because research shows that those women do a whole lot more when they are CEOs and when they're executives and when they are directors. So if you make me make my own table, then you've got some real competition on your hands. Or you can pay me what I'm worth. And I think that translates into a lot of other areas. Even if I'm an employee on the job and we're around the table and I have an idea and my voice is being silenced, continue to speak out. Continue to speak out. Sometimes, and I've been in this situation before where I've said something and it was like crickets in the room, and a man said the exact same thing. And voila, he's boy genius at the table. Just reminding them that I said that 5 minutes ago, or going to Boy Genius and speaking to him about it. I just think that it's important for us to not look past the aggressions anymore. We have to continue to speak up about them. Obviously, and I'm one of those advocates for finding the right place and finding the right space to say it, but just don't let people get away with it anymore. And if you know that you are here, and if you're confident that you are here for a reason, then go for it. And don't let anyone else tell you that you shouldn't or you can't. That doesn't exist anymore. I think we live in a world where things that we thought was impossible are now possible. There are people testing out flying cars, for God's sakes. I'm worth it, and I belong here. So
I love that.
Yeah.
I really love that. My last question before we go and look at the questions in the chat. So this week, the United Nations Women announced that the theme for International Women's Day next year is Women in Leadership, Achieving an Equal Future in a COVID-19 World. And so I sat with it for a bit, because I thought to myself, we haven't even come close to achieving an equal world under normal circumstances. How are we going to do that in a COVID world? What are your thoughts on what should be happening in conversations about women in leadership in the context of the reality that we live in, where history has brought us, and the challenges that we face now to kind of move on to the next level of the battle? Nadia, shall we start with you?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that what Astra said just now really applies to this question as well, because I think that, this whole idea that nothing is impossible anymore, right? And that, that it's not linear. So absolutely, we haven't achieved equity and equality in a non-COVID world. But, maybe we can leapfrog. Maybe it's not linear. I really do believe that, building on what Astra said, that what we need to do as women, and especially as racialized women and as Black and Brown women, is really understand that we can create our own tables. COVID, non-COVID, the table that exists now is but one. And the situation of today is unlikely to be the situation of tomorrow. We all experienced that in March, where, I mean, all of us around this virtual table experienced it, in the sense that we went from one day making a living for all of us, making a living being out and about and speaking on stages, to having to pivot within a day, to being here online, to finding a way to do your work and have your message and your voice amplified in a virtual space. Within 24 hours, we did that. And so I really believe that whatever it was, I don't know what you want to call it, gumption, resilience, understanding and knowing your worth, as Astra rightly put it, that got us to a good place. For many, not all, I'm not trying to sugarcoat it. For many, for some, is the same energy that we need to bring going forward. The ability to pivot, the ability to create spaces that amplify different types of voices, that amplify different types of work. Astra mentioned the idea of being very happy not to work for you. And we live in a world now where you don't just say that and shake in your boots and hope that they actually then hire you. No, you say that and shake in your boots, knowing that you could walk away, and that somebody that looks like you can open a door for you, right? That if you don't have the means or the power or the energy just yet to create your own table, that you can join another table, that you can join forces with an Astra, with an Yvette, and be okay. And that is the power of now, in my opinion, for people that look like us. And that is the difference of now for people that look like us. And I think that keeping that energy up is something that is going to pay dividends for us for a long time to come.
I love that. I'm going to move over to our comments and questions here before we wrap up our conversation. Let us see. Nomatemba says, when open aggression isn't politically correct, the men turn to passive-aggressive and avoidant tactics, which are a form of gaslighting and erasure. Thanks, Nadia. Shaking the table is tiring, but we can't give up. No one will hand it to us.
Amen.
Yeah, absolutely. And then Nama also says, Nelson Mandela would have been another detainee at Robben Island had Winnie not played the role she did in the struggle. Those are no.
I'm getting myself a picture of Winnie to put next to my picture of Mandela.
Yeah, she's the plug. Norma also says, great advice on sitting at the table until we get the job done. I think that's directed at Astra. And then Gugu says, absolutely love and fully agree with Astra's comment that women who get a seat at the table need to correct agendas for other women. They carry an immense advantage in raising critical issues for real change. Absolutely. And that's also why it's so important to reject the notion of Black exceptionalism, where you're the only person in the room. They can only, this whole idea that success is limited for Black people. It's open to all white people, but there can only be a handful of y'all. And we've seriously bought into it as Black professionals in so many spaces. And so our fellow Black people become our biggest competition because we've got to be one up on them. And then we get into these rooms and we don't have support. We can't drive an agenda that is beneficial to Black people and their advancement in the workplace. And oftentimes, these exceptional Black professionals end up being quite victimized within those environments as they're only one of one. Busi says, powerful, I love, we must intentionally support those in relevant spaces. Noma says, vision is more important than slogans. People know who's genuine. Kuntakint. Yeah, most companies have no vision beyond the bottom line for the year. And that's an unfortunate truth. Tabile says, I love that. Indeed, anger is not a negative emotion. It just needs to be directed with intention to address the issue or situation that brought it about. Absolutely. We have to be strategic. Nono says, do you think there's such a thing as toxic femininity? For example, a strong, resilient, persevering woman of value, and those who aren't like that aren't real women of value. This thinking and talk and expectations coming from fellow women. So when women discount other women because they don't fit their ideal of this is how hard I've had to work, I've had to dress a certain way, I've had to conduct myself a certain way, and therefore women who don't do that, you devalue what they can contribute to the different spaces. Yvette, what are your views on that? Because that's a psychological thing. We've gotten those ideas from somewhere to believe that women have got to be monolithic if they want to be successful. Look one way, dress one way, carry yourself in a particular way, speak in a particular way. There's still those intersections that exist in our fight for equality and equity in the workplace for Black women.
Yeah, that's a good point. It is quite a psychological notion. And I guess it goes back to the narratives and stories you've been told about what it means to be like a woman, to be a woman, one, right? So we've always been defined in relationship to men, So when we look at feminism back in the day, women would go out and not shave, because it was about being more like a man than it was about, and it has evolved over time. And feminism doesn't have one way, there's multiple ways of feminism. Feminism is about equality and people being themselves, right? It's just about allowing people to be themselves and treating them like the person of value in any space. And because of the narratives that we've been sold about what strength looks like, for example, right? Men are strong. What assertiveness looks like, men are assertive. What respectable looks like, it has to be in a suit. And one thing that I always say is that even with our femininity, our softness, we still have value. You don't have to step into a space and start to lead like a man in order to be valued. And that's something that I hold myself accountable to say, it's okay to lead with compassion, because naturally for me, I'm more compassionate. And that is what leads you to makes you a better leader as a woman sometimes. It's okay to lead as who you are as a woman, not to aspire to become like a man, because you're kind of like disqualifying who you are. So there are notions that we
Okay, looks like we've lost Yvette for a bit with the network issues. Well, that gets resolved. I want to move on to the last comment. Sandisile says, as a reserved person, I think I just don't want to seem like a rebel raiser. So we let people get away with erasing us and our ideas or attributing our ideas to someone else. It's like, okay, if the work is important to me and it's important to me that this gets done, maybe it doesn't matter if I'm not being recognized as the originator of the idea. But then it does run the risk of you being overlooked for opportunities or other opportunities. So my struggle is, how do I stand up for myself and take up space if my personality is not very boisterous or confrontational? Astra, do you want to take a shot at that? Are you on mute?
I don't believe you have to be confrontational to confront someone. I don't believe that you also have to be boisterous to confront someone. I find, I think I am more confrontational than most, but but I think that when you get to the place where you're confident in what you're experiencing and you know that it's not right, you'll act to fix it. And maybe it just means finding the right place and time for you. It has to be a place of power that you come from. So if you're in a room and something shakes you and you just don't like the feel or the look of it, or you're not comfortable with it, it's not then and there that you may want to speak about it. You may want to get to a place where you feel strongest. Maybe that's amongst a group of friends, or maybe that is in a one-on-one scenario. But it's important to stand up for yourself, because at the end of the day, we're not psychics. You know, even as managers and directors and our bosses, they say things based on their own lived realities. This is something that Nadia talked about earlier. They're coming from their own experiences. And so they may say something to you, or they may say something that doesn't sit well with you because of the place that they're coming from. But the only way that you can make sure that doesn't happen again is if you do say something about it. And sometimes it may also be speaking to somebody else. Maybe you speak to a friend and that friend agrees with you, and that maybe that friend can be your voice. But I think it's really important to always, and I have a friend who tells me, even when your voice shakes, you still have to do it. Even if you're afraid, go in it with fear, but go in it. Don't overlook it, because it will continue to happen. It's important to say something.
Absolutely. Norma says, how do we deal with a passive-aggressive, avoidant male leader who uses divide and rule tactics to set women in a team against each other?
I was in a situation like that. I had one of my first jobs was in an organization where the only male was the CEO, and he had hired directors that were all female. And I thought that it was weird when I first went in there, and I didn't realize that that was a tactic. It was a tactic to make sure, and he was a very big man. He was tall, and physically, he was overbearing. But he also used the women around him to divide and conquer. He would pick favorites, and and the way I dealt with it was I tried everything. I tried being boisterous and confrontational, and I tried lots of other ways. I tried, speaking to him one-on-one. And the thing that worked for me was when I pulled the women in and I spoke to them. And some of them didn't like me. We weren't friends, but it was then that I realized that I don't have to be your friend to be your ally. And so a lot of us had different experiences, individual experiences with this one male boss that we were all collectively able to come together on when we pulled ourselves to the side and spoke about it. And we confronted him as a team.
Awesome. Thank you, Astra. Second last question is from Busi, and she says, what is your take on female inclusion in leadership, politics, socio-economic structures, etc.? I know that we are all responsible to make diversity a collective accountability. However, I find it difficult to want to be included on a system that was designed to exclude us. Nadia, what's your take on that?
Well, maybe just let me answer it this way. I think it's okay that you don't want to be included in a system that was designed to exclude you. Like we were saying before, that is your prerogative. And the joy of today, the joy of this moment, is that you can decide not to. You can decide to create your own table. But what I would say to you is, don't, in my opinion, don't go about bucking the system and deciding that you don't want to be part of the system in a way that forces you to exclude your other sisters that have decided that the path to their success and the path to what they believe is equity, because it's different than your path and because it's different than what you want, is seen as less than. I think that, we've been talking a lot about the fact that we can't do it alone and that we have to bring other women in, and we have to, pull up those, though, as we climb, we need to pull up from behind us. And I think that it's important to realize that pulling up behind us doesn't mean that you bring a woman into the exact same position that you're in. No. What it means is that you create space and possibility for women in all spaces, that you create the time to talk to a woman about things that you have may experienced on your journey. Decisions that you made and why you made them, recognizing that she might not make those same decisions, but just sharing your journey with her might cause her to realize, you know what, that's not my journey. My journey is over here, but thank you for speaking to me. And thank you for giving me that information that allows me to feel the power to do my own thing, to make my choice. And I think that that's what we mean when we talk about bringing other women up and bringing other women along and making space. I think it's very dangerous for us to think that our path, that somebody else's path has to be our path and vice versa. So I think it is perfectly fine if you want to build your own table. And I also think that it's fine for those women who want to sit at an already existing table. We need all voices in all spaces.
I completely agree. The last question is from Tabi Singh, and she says, good evening all. When you're still new at a company, when do you start speaking up for yourself? When someone takes credit for your work without being called problematic or a crybaby as the youngest Black woman in the boardroom? How do you even approach the situation? Anybody can take this question.
Nadia, were you gonna?
I was actually just going to repeat what you said before, Astra. So you
can. I was going to repeat it as well. When I was appointed as Consul General, I was appointed as one of only 2 women worldwide as Consul General for my country, and the youngest. And when we were going around the table and when we are going around the table and having conversations, and sometimes things that I say may be repeated, or I feel like I've said that already, why didn't you listen? I speak up the first time. It's never too early. It's always about delivery, though. I think delivery is really, really important. But if you start off silencing your voice, then the longer those people interact with you, that's when it's going to become jarring to them to say, oh, is there a problem now? But if you start off right out of the gate, as respectful as you possibly can be, to speak up and to speak out when things don't look right or don't feel right, I think people will learn to respect that they are going to hear your voice. They'll learn to expect your voice even, and they'll respect the things that you have to say. Delivery is key.
Absolutely. Absolutely. One of the things that has also helped me quite a lot in figuring out how to deal with specific people to be able to get the results that I want, actually is a trick that I learned from my mom, because my mom is trained in face reading. And so when I'm going to go and meet with somebody, I'll show her the person's face and we'll figure out what type of person they are, what type of information they respond well to. Are they emotional, or are they more about stats and figures? Are they narcissistic and will not hear anything you have to say, or are they good listeners? Are they open-minded? Do they have an affinity to women as opposed to men? Who do they feel more comfortable with? There's so many ways in which we can figure out how to approach different people when we actually have access to those tools. So that has really, really helped me quite a bit. And obviously for people who don't have access to knowing skills around face reading, spending some time researching who you're going to be speaking to. Look at their LinkedIn. Look at what type of conversations they participate in so you can see their views on particular issues. Engage with your peers who've interacted with them or who have been at the organization for much longer to understand how to best approach them in a way that brings their guard down and makes them receptive to what it is that you have to say. Because as much as you can be so incredibly upset, and rightfully so, about the challenges that you're facing, you have to kind of take your upset and leave it aside sometimes and just go into it in a very clinical manner to get the outcome that you want. And that brings us to the end of today's event. And this time has just flown by. It feels like we've only been chatting for 30 minutes. But I just want to say thank you so, so much to Astra, Nadia, and Yvette for generously sharing your time and insights with us today. And to everybody who was watching, thank you so much for spending your Saturday with us. And I truly do encourage you to not let this conversation just end here. Let it expand to your networks, socially as well as professionally, and let it lead to action at some point. If you'd like to find out more about Konnekted or to sign up for the class of 2021, which is now open for registration, please visit my website, sihlebolani.com. If you enjoyed today's conversation and speakers, then you would also enjoy my podcast, The Workplace Revolution with Sihle Bolani. I have incredible conversations with incredible Black women from different parts of the world. And what they share is truly impactful and so, so important. And Astra and Nadia are actually two of the women who I feature on my episodes. And the insights that come out of the conversations with them are truly, truly enlightening and so beneficial for our journeys as women in the workplace and in other areas of our lives as well. My podcast is available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Anchor. And then I'm very, very excited to announce for the first time that I'll be kicking off a series called Unheard Sessions, Working Women Worldwide, from January next year. And these are going to be monthly listening sessions that will take the format of group coaching starting in January 2021. I will be sharing the event link with everybody via email so that you can secure your ticket if you would like to participate. Spaces are limited, so if you miss out on January, you can always try and join us for February. The events will be open for bookings next week, and I will let everybody who's part of this webinar to get first dibs before I announce the events on my platforms next week. Lastly, I have opened up registrations for private career coaching on my website as well. I do work with clients for a period of 6 months if I'm going to be working with you as your private coach. And I only take 4 clients per 6-month period. So you can find out more about that on my website as well at sihlebolani.com. Again, thank you so, so much for your time, for your insights, for your questions and engagement. And I'm really looking forward to taking these conversations further as we have more and more of these events. Astra, Nadia, and Yvette, where can people find you online if they would like to connect with you?
I'm available at Astra Armbrister-Rolle across all platforms.
Thank you.
Nadia? I think I'm Nadia.Theodore across all platforms. Either Nadia.Theodore or Nadia_Theodore. I don't even know.
And Yvette?
For me, it's Yvette_Aloe. _ALOE on all social platforms, and www.yvettealoe.co.za. And one last thing that I want to add to the lady that had the last question, it's burning, so I'm going to leave it here, is that when somebody does something in the workplace that makes you uncomfortable, just send them an email saying, I noticed that you, or just say, I noticed that you. So you're not accusing them, you're just saying you noticed something. It's up to them how they respond to that. So that's just another tip, that you just say, I noticed that you. So you're not accusing, you're just saying, I noticed that every time I send you send me emails on Saturdays instead of on Fridays before work ends, I noticed that you, when I try to bring up something, you cut me off in the meeting. You don't have to say what's up with that. You just bring it up. And then that starts the conversation. It's not accusational. And it's also just an easy way to open up the conversation. They'll say, oh, I didn't notice I was doing that. Or the response will be different. But that's one good way to bring it up. That's it. Yeah.
That's a very, very good point. Very, very valuable, but also very good at diffusing what could be a very explosive situation if handled the wrong way. So thank you so much for sharing that, Yvette. Thank you so, so much to everyone. I wish you an incredible rest of your Saturday. And please do keep a lookout for more and more of these conversations as we go forward. And Takia, thank you for putting this together, working behind the scenes as usual, making the magic happen. Thank you so much, ladies.
Thank you.
We even had, is it Sandisile? Oh, Samkeliso, who is with us from Zimbabwe, which is amazing. So thank you so much to everybody. And this is where we call it a night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.